Have you ever wondered what it would feel like to be buried alive? Not alone, but with 26 frightened children beside you, all trapped in the dark, underground, with no way out. In the summer of 1976, in the quiet town of Chowchilla, California, that nightmare became a reality. 26 school children, aged between 5 and 14, along with their bus driver, simply vanished. They were on their way home from a swimming trip when their bright yellow school bus was hijacked. And then, nothing. No bus, no driver, no children, only silence and panic. Before we step into this chilling yet remarkable story of survival, calm your mind and take a moment. You're about to hear a true account that unfolds like a suspense novel, but every moment of it is real. And if you enjoy calm, deeply researched stories like this one, we'd love it if you took a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and comment below with where in the world you're watching from. It helps build a peaceful community of true crime listeners, and we're so glad you're here. Now, let's go back to Chowchilla, California, July 15th, 1976. It was a sweltering Thursday afternoon, the kind that makes the air feel thick and heavy, the kind of day where the sun seems to hang motionless in the sky. Chowchilla, a small agricultural town nestled in California's Central Valley, was winding down from another long hot day. At around 4 p.m., a cheerful group of students from Dairyland Elementary School was wrapping up a field trip to the local community swimming pool. The trip had been a welcome break, a reward for hard work at school, and a much-needed way to cool down in the unrelenting heat. Their driver that day was a 55-year-old man named Ed Ray. A quiet, dependable presence, Ed was well liked by the students and known in the community as someone who took his job seriously. He had driven that route for years. That afternoon, he guided the bus out from the pool parking lot and onto Avenue 21, the familiar country road that would take them home. The ride should have taken maybe 30 minutes, but somewhere along the way, it all went terribly wrong. About 15 minutes into the drive, as the yellow school bus rolled past cotton fields and farmland, a white van suddenly blocked the road. At first, Ed Ray thought the vehicle had broken down, but then, two men in overalls and ski masks stepped into the road, waving shotguns. They weren't there to ask for help. Ed hit the brakes. The bus lurched to a stop. Before the children could make sense of what was happening, the doors swung open. The masked men climbed aboard, pointing guns at the driver and the kids. There were no screams, just stunned silence. One of the masked men barked out orders. Another forced Ed Ray to the back of the bus. The children, bewildered and scared, watched in disbelief as their trusted bus driver was restrained and told to stay quiet. The men ordered the children off the bus, not all at once, but in small groups. Outside, another van had arrived. The children were herded into the back, one after another. The process took time. The kidnappers were methodical, careful not to be seen. Eventually, every child and the bus driver was squeezed into two different vans. To make sure no one could see out, the vans had been specially modified. The interiors were covered in metal and wood paneling. No windows, no handles on the inside, just a sealed mobile prison. Back in Chowchilla, the school bus was reported missing. At first, nobody panicked. Delays weren't unheard of. Sometimes, Ed Ray took detours or dropped off students in different orders. But as night began to fall, and parents started calling the school, it became clear something was wrong. When law enforcement finally found the abandoned school bus later that evening, stranded in a dry riverbed, it was empty. No Ed Ray, no children. The vehicle had been driven off the main road and hidden behind bamboo and trees, the kind of place that wouldn't be seen from the air or from the highway. Authorities were stunned. A full bus load of children had simply vanished. Word spread quickly. By nightfall, a media storm had begun to swirl around Chowchilla. Reporters descended on the tiny farming community. Local police were joined by the FBI. Roadblocks were set up. Fields were searched. Theories flew. Had it been a cult, a hijacking, a bizarre accident? As the investigation unfolded, the 27 hostages were still trapped. The two vans drove for nearly 12 hours, a disorienting journey with no windows, no stops, and barely any ventilation. The children, many of them terrified and crying, tried to stay calm in the stifling heat. Finally, sometime after 3 a.m., the van stopped. The doors opened. One by one, the captives were forced out into the night. They had no idea where they were, but it wasn't Chowchilla. They were led into a dusty clearing in a quarry. In front of them was something almost surreal, a large moving van buried beneath the ground. It had been carefully concealed, with only a small opening on top, and a wooden ladder leading down into it. The kidnappers had spent weeks preparing it. They'd reinforced the interior with wood, added mattresses and some jugs of water, but there was no light, no food, no working toilet, just a black, suffocating underground chamber. One by one, the children and Ed Ray were told to climb down into the buried truck. When the last of them was inside, the ladder was pulled up. Then came the final horror. The kidnappers began shoveling dirt and heavy metal into the opening, sealing them in. Above them, silence returned. Beneath the surface, the children huddled together in the dark. They were 12 feet underground, and no one knew where they were. This was not a random crime. The kidnappers had a plan. They were going to demand a ransom of $5 million from the state of California. That ransom call was never made. Back in Chowchilla, the children's families waited in agony. Days passed. National news reported on the strange disappearance, but there were no solid leads. And yet, deep in the ground, something extraordinary was about to happen. Because these kids, and their bus driver, weren't ready to give up. They were scared, but they were also brave, and that bravery was about to turn the entire case on its head. In the next part, we'll go underground, into the buried truck itself, to discover how Ed Ray and a few remarkable children found a way to escape what seemed like an inescapable prison. Inside the buried trailer, the air was thick and unmoving. The only light came from the faintest cracks in the ceiling, and even that disappeared quickly, as the kidnappers shoveled heavy sheets of plywood and dirt over the opening. The metal box, once a standard moving truck, had been turned into an eerie underground cell. The sides were reinforced with steel and wood, the walls lined with dirty mattresses, and a few jugs of water sat scattered around. There were no bathrooms, no clean air, and no clear way out. 26 children, ranging from kindergartners to teenagers, and one middle-aged man, Ed Ray, sat silently in the dim, oppressive dark. No one screamed, no one moved at first. The fear was too thick. Like the dirt above them, it pressed down on their shoulders. It took time for their eyes to adjust. Then slowly, questions began to form. Where were they? Would they be found? What did the kidnappers want? The children, despite their age, were remarkably composed. Some began to whisper to each other. Others cried silently, but they stayed together. Ed Ray moved from one to another, checking on them, reassuring them, giving comfort where he could. He was the only adult, but he wasn't alone in keeping everyone calm. Two older boys, 14-year-old Mike Marshall and his friend Robert Gonzalez, began to take initiative. Mike was tall, athletic, and level-headed. Robert was quiet, but observant. Both had a sense that this wasn't the end, that maybe, just maybe, there was a way out. The captives tried to keep track of time, but without light or clocks, it was nearly impossible. Some of the younger children tried to sleep, others clung to their siblings. The air grew hotter, more stifling, with every passing hour. Sweat rolled down faces. The jugs of water, already lukewarm, were passed around carefully. Eventually, the sound of the plywood being sealed above had faded into nothing. It was silent, terrifyingly silent. Ed Ray knew he had to keep the children occupied. He started singing familiar songs. "If You're Happy and You Know It," echoed awkwardly in the hollow darkness. Some children joined in, others didn't, but the songs gave them rhythm, something to hold on to. They played little games, they talked, they waited, but as the hours ticked by, the fear that they might be left there forever crept back in. Mike and Robert, watching the walls of the truck and inspecting the ceiling as best they could, noticed that the only thing between them and the outside world was a hatch that had been hastily boarded and covered. It had been sealed from the outside with a heavy metal plate and then buried under more than 1,000 pounds of dirt. The kidnappers had made a critical mistake though. They hadn't secured the hatch well enough. Mike began inspecting the lid. It was made of wood, with some steel framing. Above it were large truck batteries, and a few pieces of scrap metal, likely added to weigh it down. Dirt had been packed on top to hide everything. It looked impossible to lift. But Mike refused to give up. He pulled at the wood, scraped at the edges, and tried to wedge his fingers into the seams. The other children joined in. At first it was futile, but they kept trying, again and again, using sticks, pieces of scrap, anything they could find. Eventually, they loosened one corner, then another, but the weight was still too much. They needed a break, physically and mentally. That's when Ed Ray gathered them all again, and told them to lie still, conserve energy, and wait for the heat to drop. As night fell above them, the temperature began to fall slightly. That gave them just enough strength for one more push. Mike, Robert, and Ed worked together. They built a crude ladder by stacking up the mattresses and wooden slats from inside the truck. Then they climbed. Mike wedged himself under the hatch. With everything he had, he pushed, and finally, it gave. The dirt above shifted and fell inward. Air rushed in, cold, fresh air. After 16 hours trapped underground, they had found the sky again. Mike scrambled up, pushing away the remaining dirt. Then Robert, then Ed. They looked around, blinking in the moonlight. They weren't anywhere near Chowchilla. They were in Livermore, more than 100 miles north. But they were alive. One by one, they pulled the children out. It took nearly an hour to get everyone free. The youngest ones cried. Some were too tired to walk, but they were out. Just before sunrise, the entire group made their way to a nearby rock quarry office. A stunned employee called the police, and with that call, one of the most unbelievable kidnapping cases in American history came to a turning point. Back in Chowchilla, there had been little sleep. Parents had waited for nearly 2 full days without answers. When the news broke that the children were alive and safe, people poured into the streets. There were tears, cheers, utter disbelief. The national press went into a frenzy. Who would do such a thing? And why? But while the children were being reunited with their families, the kidnappers were already on the run, and what came next would reveal a plot so bizarre, it almost defied belief. Because the 3 men behind the crime weren't hardened criminals, they weren't strangers to the town, they weren't even desperate, they were rich. In the next part, we'll delve into the identities of the kidnappers, 3 young men from wealthy families, whose twisted plan had been in the works for months, and we'll explore how they were finally caught, thanks to a combination of arrogance, paper trails, and one very observant FBI agent. The relief in Chowchilla was short-lived. The children were home. Ed Ray was a hero, but the terrifying question still hung in the air: who would kidnap 26 children and bury them alive? Law enforcement, shaken but galvanized, began combing the crime scene at the rock quarry in Livermore, California. The buried trailer had already begun collapsing in on itself from the weight of the soil above. Had the children remained there another few hours, it's possible they would have suffocated. The FBI quickly took over the investigation. The sheer scale and cruelty of the crime demanded federal attention, and within days, they had a few solid leads, thanks in part to something the kidnappers had left behind the truck. Buried just a few feet away from the trailer, hidden under tarps and debris, was a white van. It was partially obscured, but intact, and inside were documents, rental forms, a receipt from a hardware store, a discarded glove, with initials stitched inside. The FBI followed the paper trail, and it led them straight to one of the most shocking truths of the case. The first name to come up was Frederick Newhall Woods 5. Frederick wasn't just anyone. He was the son of a wealthy and prominent California family. The Woods family owned the quarry where the children had been buried, the same quarry the kidnappers had used as their staging ground. Frederick had access to the site. He knew how remote it was. He knew no one would come looking there. The second name was James Schoenfeld, a close friend of Frederick's. Like Frederick, James came from wealth. His family was involved in private education and business. James had a younger brother, Richard Schoenfeld, who had also been involved. 3 men, all from affluent families, all in their 20s, all with expensive cars, trust funds, and no real financial troubles. So why? The motive, as strange as it may seem, was money, but not in the way most kidnappings go. Frederick, James, and Richard had a plan, a bold, cinematic, absurd plan. They wanted to kidnap a bus full of children, bury them alive in a secret location, and then demand a $5 million ransom from the state of California. Their logic was chilling. Children were valuable. The government would pay to get them back, and with that money, they could solve all their problems, mostly related to failed business ventures, and the pressure of living up to their family names. They even kept a notebook, titled Plan, which outlined the steps in detail. They had diagrams, timelines, equipment lists. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment crime. It had been plotted for over a year. They had originally tried to hijack another school bus earlier in the summer, but failed. They spent weeks scouting rural areas for remote burial spots. They eventually settled on the family-owned quarry, because it was accessible and secluded. When the kidnapping actually happened, their plan almost went off without a hitch. Almost. But they made one crucial error. They left the children in the buried trailer, intending to call the Chowchilla police department later that night with their demands. But when they got back to their hideout to make the ransom call, the phone lines were jammed. Why? Because the media had picked up the story. Chowchilla was flooded with reporters, calls from panicked parents, and law enforcement coordination. The switchboard was overloaded. The three kidnappers tried for hours to get through. They couldn't. Frustrated and exhausted, they decided to take a nap, just for a little while. When they woke up, they learned something they never expected. The kids had escaped. Panic set in. They abandoned their plan. They fled. Within days, the FBI had issued arrest warrants. Richard Schumfeld turned himself in first. James was caught soon after. Frederick, the ringleader, fled across state lines. He was eventually captured in Canada. The public was outraged. These weren't desperate men. They weren't from broken homes or tragic circumstances. They were rich, educated, privileged, and they had kidnapped innocent children, not for revenge, not for hate, but for money. It sparked a national debate about crime, class, and the failures of the American justice system. At trial, the three men pleaded guilty to kidnapping with bodily harm, a charge that carried life sentences without parole. But justice, like the crime itself, would not follow a simple path. In the coming years, legal battles and public outcry would lead to unexpected twists in their sentences. Appeals would be filed, hearings held, and in a move that shocked the survivors and their families, two of the men would eventually be paroled. But that's a story for later. For now, the focus remained on recovery. The children of Chowchilla returned home to a different world, one filled with cameras, reporters, and questions they didn't know how to answer. The town became famous overnight, but for reasons no one wanted. Next we'll explore what happened to the survivors in the weeks and months after the kidnapping. How do you return to school after being buried alive? How do parents explain what happened to a 6-year-old? How do you find peace in a town now defined by one terrible day? The sun rose slowly over Chowchilla, the morning after the children were found, soft, golden, and silent. A small town in California's San Joaquin Valley, once sleepy and unremarkable, had become the center of national attention. News vans lined the streets, cameras clicked and whirred, reporters paced sidewalks with microphones in hand, shouting questions that no one wanted to answer. But inside the homes of the 26 children, there was only stillness. For many of them, that first day back was not celebration, it was confusion, relief mixed with exhaustion. Their parents wrapped them in blankets, hugged them so tight it hurt, and cried until they couldn't anymore. And still, the children didn't quite understand why everyone was so scared. They had survived, hadn't they? But the trauma, that slow creeping underground fear, would not vanish with the light. Some couldn't sleep, others refused to speak. One child begged his parents not to close the closet door at night. Another had sudden panic attacks anytime he saw a white van. A few would not ride the school bus again for years, if ever. Ed Ray, the bus driver who had helped lead the children through the dark and out into the light, was hailed as a hero. He was a tall, quiet man with white hair and a calm voice, known for being reliable and kind. The children had trusted him during the ordeal, and afterward, many couldn't stop clinging to him. He received thousands of letters from across the country, praising his bravery. President Gerald Ford wrote him a personal thank you, Schools awarded him plaques. Chowchilla named a day in his honor. But Ed Ray never thought of himself as a hero. When asked about it, he often shook his head. "I was just trying to get them home," he said. Still, he too struggled with nightmares. The parents' silent grief. For the families of the kidnapped children, the return of their sons and daughters didn't bring peace. It brought new kinds of fear. Could it happen again? Would their children ever feel safe? What would happen when the reporters left and the town returned to normal? Many of the parents began sleeping on the floors of their children's bedrooms. Others quietly enrolled their kids in therapy, though therapy wasn't as common then, especially in small towns, and it carried a stigma. Most just tried to move on, to act like things were fine, but things were not fine. The town itself seemed to hold its breath. Chowchilla had always been a farming community, hard-working, humble and quiet. But now it was famous, and not for anything it wanted to be known for. The name Chowchilla became synonymous with buried children. There were whispers, then rumors, then books and TV specials. Locals couldn't go anywhere without being asked about that kidnapping. Businesses saw a strange uptick in visitors, but no one wanted to talk about crops or machinery. They wanted to see the school, the bus route, the families. The trauma had become a tourist attraction. The children speak out, or don't. Some of the children gave interviews in the weeks after the kidnapping. A few appeared on national talk shows, sitting awkwardly next to their parents while interviewers asked gentle, but invasive, questions. What was it like in the trailer? Were you scared? What do you want to say to the kidnappers? Some kids answered. Some stayed silent. Some fidgeted, until the interview was over. One young girl stared straight into the camera and whispered, "I thought I was going to die down there." But most of the survivors didn't talk publicly again for years. Some still haven't. What's remarkable is that so many of them stayed in Chowchilla. They went back to school, back to sports, back to music and play and summer jobs. But none of it was the same. Children who had once been carefree were suddenly watchful, nervous, changed. Their classmates treated them differently too. Some with sympathy, others with jealousy or suspicion. A few of the younger ones became more withdrawn. Some struggled in school for years afterward. At least one survivor dropped out of high school entirely. Another battled substance abuse. A few struggled with relationships, with trust, with simply feeling like the world was safe. Legal aftershocks. As the survivors tried to piece their lives back together, the legal system began grinding forward. Frederick Woods and the Schoenfeld brothers were in custody. Their faces appeared on the news, not like monsters, but clean-cut young men in polo shirts and sport jackets. The public was outraged. How could these men from good families, with money and education, be capable of such cruelty? Prosecutors pushed for the harshest punishment, life without the possibility of parole, and they got it, for a while. But soon defense attorneys began to argue that because no one had died, and no physical harm had come to the children in the most literal medical sense, the sentence should be reconsidered. They claimed the men were remorseful, that it had been a bad plan, not a violent one. The families, outraged, pushed back hard. Still, over the years, the tides of law shifted. Richard Schoenfeld was released in 2012, James followed in 2015, and after more than a dozen failed parole attempts, Frederick Woods, the mastermind, was granted parole in 2022. He had served more than 40 years, but to many it still wasn't enough. He left prison a wealthy man, thanks to a series of business ventures and investments made while behind bars. One survivor later said, "They got to live their lives. I'm still stuck in that trailer." Lasting shadows. Nearly every survivor of the Chowchilla kidnapping has spoken about it in recent years. Some went decades without saying a word, then finally opened up in documentaries, books or interviews. Some found healing, others are still trying. Many still keep in touch with one another. They see each other at reunions, at funerals, at public events honoring Ed Ray, who passed away in 2012. They are bound together not by choice, but by experience. Some of them became teachers. One became a school bus driver, like Ed. Others chose quiet lives, far away from the spotlight. The fear never fully disappeared, but it did shift. Some survivors have said they now see themselves as stronger, closer, wiser. They know what it's like to face death and choose to fight back. The lessons we almost didn't learn. The Chowchilla kidnapping changed how schools handled student transportation. Security protocols were reviewed. Background checks became stricter. Police training was updated. Even the FBI began re-evaluating its approach to rural crimes and ransom cases. But more importantly, it became a symbol of survival, of resilience, and of the dangers that can come from even the most unlikely places. 3 rich young men thought they could steal children, bury them alive, and walk away with millions, but they underestimated the strength of those children, and the strength of one 55-year-old man who refused to give up. In the next part we'll revisit the buried trailer itself, how it was constructed, what the kidnappers got wrong, and why experts believe the escape should have been impossible. We'll walk through the mechanics of the plan, and examine the haunting physical space, where 27 people waited in the dark for someone to find them, or for the air to run out. In the stillness of a dusty Livermore quarry, hidden from view by hills and brush, there sat a dark secret, a moving van buried 12 feet underground. Inside, beneath thousands of pounds of dirt, 26 children and their bus driver lay trapped. The van had been converted into a makeshift prison, a structure designed not just to hold them, but to keep them invisible. Let's go back to that van. Let's really understand what the children were up against, and what made their survival so unlikely. To anyone passing by, the old quarry seemed empty. The entrance had a locked gate. The land was private. A pile of freshly moved dirt might raise questions in another place, but in a quarry, it was just another mound in a landscape of dust and gravel. But underneath it all was a semi-trailer, a moving van roughly 8 feet wide, 12 feet long and tall enough for a grown man to stoop through. Its interior had been modified in chilling ways. The windows were sealed, the walls were reinforced. On the inside, mattresses lined the floor, stacked in places to cushion the drop when the kidnappers forced the children to climb in. 2 wooden toilets, simple buckets, had been bolted into the corners. A few jugs of water, some cereal, a box of bread. Not enough for 27 people for long, barely enough for a single day. And then there were the air holes. The kidnappers had drilled ventilation shafts, small narrow pipes that reached from the trailer up through the dirt. At first glance, they might seem like a clever detail, but in reality, they were nearly fatal. As the trailer settled under the weight of the soil, some of the shafts collapsed. Dirt clogged the holes, oxygen thinned. The children began to feel it. Dizziness, heat, nausea. The air grew stale. A thick oppressive warmth settled over them. It wasn't just a prison, it was a tomb. The engineering behind the trap later. Investigators would marvel at the sheer logistics of the buried trailer. Moving it, burying it, constructing it, all without anyone noticing, was a massive task. The kidnappers had planned for over a year. They had purchased the trailer, modified it, and used construction equipment to dig the hole and bury it on land owned by Frederick Wood's father. They even reinforced the ceiling of the van with wooden beams and a metal sheet, thinking it would support the weight of the dirt above. But they weren't engineers. The reinforcements began to buckle. With every passing hour, the ceiling sagged just a little more. Wood creaked. The air inside grew hotter. To the children, it felt like the walls were closing in, and in a way, they were. Inside the darkness, the children lay on the mattresses, some crying, some whispering. A few vomited from the heat and fear. Others huddled with Ed Ray, who tried his best to keep them calm. The bus driver was sweating through his shirt. His voice, usually steady, had begun to crack. He knew what was happening, knew how long it would take before oxygen ran out, but he couldn't show panic. He had to lead, so he did what he could. He sang softly to the youngest children. He spoke calmly to the older ones. He counted heads. He tried to keep them occupied, even as the hours dragged on. Then came the first noises: shifting wood, cracking metal, dirt falling from the ceiling. That's when the panic began to rise. Planning the escape among the oldest boys in the group was 14-year-old Michael Marshall. Strong, calm and quick thinking, Michael had already begun surveying the trailer from the moment they were pushed inside.
He noticed the ceiling beams. He noticed the weak spot where the air shaft was failing. He whispered to Ed Ray, "We have to get out of here." At first Ray wasn't sure. They didn't know how much dirt was above them. They could collapse the whole thing if they made the wrong move. But Michael insisted, "We'll suffocate in here." So together, Ed and a few of the boys began stacking the mattresses into a makeshift tower. They climbed it, testing the roof. It groaned under their weight. Michael used a metal rod from one of the supports to begin prying at the cover near the air shaft. It took hours. The air was growing thinner by the minute, but finally with one last push they broke through.
Clawing toward daylight. They couldn't climb out just yet. The hole was narrow, and above the van was a dense layer of dirt. So the boys took turns digging, clawing at the earth, throwing it down into the trailer below. It took them hours, perhaps even more than a day. The children below watched silently, eyes wide. Every scrape of the shovel was a small flicker of hope. Finally, a hole formed, a narrow tunnel to the surface. Michael was the first to wriggle through it. He emerged covered in dirt, blinking in the afternoon sun. He looked around. Silence. No kidnappers, no police, just the empty quarry. He turned back and began pulling the others up, one by one. It took hours to get everyone out. When the last child was lifted free, the sky had begun to shift to pink. They had done the impossible. The rescue begins meanwhile. Back in Chowchilla, parents were still pacing their kitchens, unable to eat, unable to speak. Reporters stood outside the police station. The phone lines were tied up. Rumors swirled, ransom demands, FBI agents, threats of violence. But then the call came. A worker at the quarry had discovered a child. Then another, then another. Police raced to the scene. Soon a line of school children, coated in dust, blinking in disbelief, was walking out of the woods, led by Ed Ray and Michael Marshall. A sheriff's deputy looked at the group and fell to his knees. "We thought you were gone," he whispered. They loaded the children into patrol cars and ambulances, not because they were injured, but because it was the only way to get them back to town fast enough. At the police station, parents clutched one another, crying as their children walked in. One mother screamed when she saw her daughter, then collapsed in relief. Another just stood and stared, too shocked to speak. They were home. How did they survive? Experts would later debate how anyone could have survived those conditions. Between the heat, the collapsing ceiling, and the limited air, the trailer had been a death trap. If they had waited just a few more hours, the story could have ended very differently. The children's survival was a mix of luck, determination, and quick thinking. Michael Marshall became a local hero, though he often downplayed his role. Ed Ray, too, remained humble, but it was clear to everyone in Chowchilla, without him the story might have ended in tragedy. What the kidnappers didn't count on Frederick Woods and the Schoenfeld brothers had imagined the children would sit quietly in the trailer until a ransom was paid. They hadn't expected resistance. They hadn't expected kids to think critically or to fight. They hadn't expected Ed Ray. Their entire plan, meticulously designed over months, was foiled not by the FBI, or helicopters, or police dogs, but by children who refused to give up. In the next part, we'll turn our attention to the kidnappers themselves. Who were they? Why did three privileged young men decide to bury a school bus full of children? And how did their greed blind them to the gravity of their crime? The world was still reeling. The children had emerged alive, the horror had ended, and the town of Chowchilla began its long journey toward healing. But as the dust settled, a new question gripped the nation: who would do such a thing? The answer was almost as shocking as the crime itself. They weren't hardened criminals or escaped convicts. They weren't international terrorists or strangers from another world. No, the men behind the Chowchilla kidnapping were three wealthy, educated young adults from one of the most affluent parts of California. Their names were Frederick Newhall Woods Falfe, James Schoenfeld, and Richard Schoenfeld. Not exactly the profile you'd expect for people capable of orchestrating one of the largest mass kidnappings in US history. Let's go back and look at how they became the architects of a nightmare. The Newhall legacy Frederick Woods was born into privilege. His family owned substantial property and business holdings in California. In fact, the very quarry where the trailer was buried belonged to his father, a secluded expanse of land with little oversight and a conveniently locked gate, perfect for hiding something or someone. Woods had a reputation for being quiet, intelligent, and a bit odd. He wasn't a troublemaker, but he also wasn't thriving. In his early 20s at the time of the kidnapping, Frederick had dropped out of college and seemed adrift. Despite his family's wealth, he was looking for an easy way to get richer. His dream. According to later reports, he wanted to start a car museum, but dreams like that require funding, and fast money doesn't always come from hard work, it can come from crime. That's where the Schoenfeld brothers entered the picture. The Schoenfelds, a family affair. James and Richard Schoenfeld also came from a wealthy Bay Area background. Their father owned a lucrative business. They had access to education, money and opportunities that many could only dream of. But like Frederick, they weren't content. James was the older of the two, studious, a little rigid. Richard was younger, more impulsive, but highly influenced by his brother and Frederick. The trio met through mutual friends. Over time, they developed a bond, not over shared ideals or ambitions, but over disillusionment and greed. By 1976, they had convinced themselves of something utterly outrageous, that they could kidnap dozens of children, hold them for ransom, and get away with it. $1 million plan. The target ransom was $5 million. That's about $25 million in today's money. The plan was modeled after a plotline from a book called Dirty Harry, in which children are taken hostage and held underground. Inspired by fiction, and emboldened by their perceived intelligence, the three men began gathering supplies. They purchased the semi-truck trailer used in the burial. They obtained walkie-talkies, firearms, ammunition, and disguises. They also carefully tracked school bus routes, looking for a town with a schedule they could intercept. Chowchilla, a quiet farming community with little law enforcement presence, became their chosen target. The terrifying genius of the plan wasn't just in its mechanics, it was in its cold logic. Burying the children made them harder to find. It also gave the kidnappers time to make their ransom demands without immediate risk of discovery. The trailer was their insurance policy. They thought it was foolproof. They were wrong. Why didn't the ransom call come? One of the most bizarre details of the case was that for over 12 hours after the kidnapping, the kidnappers didn't even make a ransom call. Why? The official reason later revealed was almost laughable. They were asleep. After burying the children, the trio drove to their hideout to prepare the ransom call, but by the time they arrived, they were exhausted. They lay down for a nap. By the time they woke up, their hostages had already escaped. In the end, it wasn't heroic police work or a clever sting operation that brought the children home. It was a tragicomedy of errors on the part of the kidnappers. The manhunt begins. Once the children were safe, the FBI launched a full-scale investigation. Tips poured in from all over the state, but the biggest break came from an unexpected source, a clue left behind by the kidnappers themselves. Inside the buried trailer, one of the children had found a scrap of paper with a vehicle registration number on it. Investigators traced it back to the Woods family. That led them directly to Frederick. A search of his father's property revealed the buried trailer and evidence of extensive planning. Police quickly linked James and Richard Schoenfeld to the operation, but by the time warrants were issued, the three men had vanished. For a short time, the kidnappers were officially fugitives. The FBI placed them on the most wanted list. A national manhunt was underway. Richard Schoenfeld was the first to turn himself in, within a week. His brother James followed shortly after. But Frederick Woods, he was gone. The international chase. Woods fled California, reportedly traveling through several states before eventually being captured in Vancouver, Canada. He was found living under an alias, and authorities extradited him back to the United States. The trial that followed would grip the country once more, not just for the scale of the crime, but because of who these men were. They weren't strangers. They weren't outsiders. They were privileged sons of powerful families. And now they were facing life in prison. The trial and sentencing, all three men were charged with 27 counts of kidnapping and 27 counts of robbery. Initially they pleaded not guilty, but as the evidence mounted and the public pressure grew, they changed their pleas. In 1977, all three were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. It seemed like justice had been served. But the story wasn't over. In the next part, we'll explore how the legal system began to shift, and how parole hearings, legal appeals, and behind-the-scenes efforts would keep this case in the spotlight for decades to come. Despite the horror they inflicted, these men would eventually walk free. How did that happen? After the dust of the trial settled, and the courtroom doors closed, the people of Chowchilla expected to never hear the names Frederick Woods, James Schoenfeld, or Richard Schoenfeld again. The world had called them monsters. The judge sentenced them to life without parole. Justice, it seemed, had been served. But the law, like memory, can be surprisingly flexible over time. What followed was not a straightforward conclusion, but a slow and unsettling unraveling of consequences. Because as the years wore on, cracks began to form in the walls of that life without parole sentence, and the children who had been buried alive were forced to keep reliving the nightmare in ways they never imagined. This is the story of how the Chowchilla kidnappers got second chances that many felt they never deserved. The legal loophole. When the trio was first convicted, their sentences were framed as life without the possibility of parole. That was the understanding. That was what the media reported. That was what the families of the victims were told. But there was a catch. In 1980, the California Court of Appeals quietly ruled that the men's sentences had been misapplied. According to the court, under the law at the time, life without parole could not be enforced for kidnapping unless there had been bodily harm or death. And remarkably, the children had all survived. No bruises, no broken bones, not even dehydration. Terrifying psychological trauma, yes, but in legal terms, no bodily injury. So the sentence was commuted, not reversed, not thrown out, but altered. The without parole clause was removed. Suddenly the three men were eligible for parole, after just 7 years. 7 years for kidnapping 26 children, burying them alive, and leaving them to suffocate. The families were stunned. The first parole hearings, beginning in the mid-1980s, the first of many parole hearings began. They came slowly at first, just one every few years. But they began to build. Every time one was scheduled, the victims, now teenagers and young adults, were notified. Some were asked to testify. Others refused to go. They couldn't bear to see their kidnappers again. The hearings forced the survivors to reopen old wounds. Some had spent years trying to forget the trailer, the dirt, the dark. But now they had to write letters, appear in front of panels, beg officials not to let the men who buried them walk free. The trauma they had endured was being prolonged, made permanent by a justice system that wouldn't stay closed. A divided public. Over time, the narrative began to shift. The kidnappers, especially the Schoenfeld brothers, started to present themselves as changed men. They were model inmates. No infractions. Polite. Well-spoken. One of them even earned a college degree behind bars. Supporters called them rehabilitated. Lawyers argued that the men were barely out of their teens when the crime was committed, that no one had been physically harmed, that they had served more time than many murderers. On paper their records looked clean, and for some that was enough. But for the people of Chowchilla, it felt like a betrayal. How could time and good behavior erase a crime that had been so elaborately planned, so intentionally cruel? The survivors weren't healed. They weren't free of what happened. So why should the perpetrators be? The first release, Richard Schoenfeld, in 2012. 36 years after the kidnapping, the first domino fell. Richard Schoenfeld was released. The California Board of Parole Hearings
had recommended his release years earlier, but it had been denied by then Governor Schwarzenegger. Eventually, under pressure from legal precedent, the state Supreme Court ordered that he be freed. He walked out of prison into a world where most people knew his name, and few wanted to see him in their town. He didn't speak to the media. He didn't hold a press conference. He vanished into a quiet retirement, supported by his family's money. The second release, James Schoenfeld. A few years later, in 2015, the older brother followed. James Schoenfeld was paroled at the age of 63. He had expressed deep remorse, written dozens of letters to the victims' families, and participated in prison programs aimed at understanding the impact of crime. Some believed he was genuinely sorry, but others weren't interested in apologies. Jennifer Brown Hyde, one of the victims, put it bluntly during a hearing: "You don't leave 27 people buried alive and get a second chance. You just don't." Still, the board voted in his favor. The decision stood. The last to go, Frederick Woods. Frederick Woods, the mastermind, was the hardest sell. He had been caught hoarding contraband in prison, including pornography, a cell phone, and even a hidden business operation. For years he ran a car dealership and real estate business from behind bars, using outside help to move money and manage assets. Unlike the Schoenfelds, Woods had not given up his wealth. In fact, he'd increased it. At the time of his final parole hearing, he was reportedly worth millions. Parole boards rejected him more than a dozen times. He was viewed as manipulative, lacking insight into the harm he had caused. But in 2022, after nearly 50 years in prison, Frederick Woods was paroled. And just like that, the final piece of the Chowchilla kidnapping walked free. The survivors' lives. The 26 children aboard that bus went on to become adults with children of their own. Many became parents, teachers, business owners. Some became advocates for victims' rights. Others struggled with addiction, anxiety, or PTSD. Many of them said the same thing over the years: they never really got over it. Some couldn't ride buses. Others couldn't sleep in closed rooms. Several described recurring nightmares of being buried alive. For decades, their minds remained in that trailer, trapped in a memory they could not escape. For them, the release of their kidnappers felt like justice undone, and yet they were the ones who had shown the most courage. They had survived. They had dug their way out, literally and figuratively. But the question still hung in the air: if you can bury children alive and walk free, what does justice really mean? In the next part, we'll explore the long cultural shadow of the Chowchilla kidnapping. How did this event change the way schools handled student transportation? How did it influence media, law enforcement, and even Hollywood? And why, decades later, are people still telling this story? Even decades after the last child was pulled from the trailer beneath that rock quarry, the Chowchilla kidnapping lingers in the public imagination like a bruise that never quite fades. Some crimes become cautionary tales. Others evolve into myths. But this one changed how a nation thought about safety, vulnerability, and what the human spirit could endure. What makes the Chowchilla case so haunting isn't just the scale of the crime, it's the setting. A sunny day, a cheerful yellow school bus, a small American town where children rode bikes and left their doors unlocked. The evil wasn't lurking in some shadowy alley. It was waiting on the side of the road at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. In this part, we explore the lasting effects the kidnapping had on law enforcement, schools, public policy, media, and popular culture, and why the echo of that buried bus is still heard today. The day school transportation changed forever. In the immediate aftermath of the kidnapping, school districts across the United States re-evaluated their policies around student transportation. The assumption that buses were inherently safe, a mobile extension of the school itself, was shattered. Before Chowchilla, it was not uncommon for buses in rural areas to travel long routes without radio contact or backup. Most school buses didn't have security protocols for unexpected stops. Some drivers weren't even required to carry identification. But all that changed after July 15, 1976. Suddenly, districts began installing two-way radios on school buses, allowing drivers to report issues in real time. Emergency contact procedures were developed. Check-in policies were created for bus drivers, including expected arrival time confirmations and route monitoring. In many places, it became mandatory for school buses to carry updated rosters of passengers. In some parts of California, officials even started performing random spot checks on rural routes to ensure driver and student safety. The entire perception of school transportation shifted from routine and benign to potentially vulnerable. It's hard to overstate how much fear reshaped logistics after Chowchilla. For many years, any discussion of school security, whether it involved buses, field trips or lockdown protocols, referenced the Chowchilla case in some form. Law enforcement learns a hard lesson for police and FBI investigators. The Chowchilla case served as a wake-up call on multiple fronts. First, it showed how easily, even a large-scale crime could slip under the radar if no one left a clear trace. The kidnappers used pre-dug graves and had planned their alibi for months. The school bus itself wasn't reported missing until several hours after the event had begun, highlighting major gaps in rural emergency communication systems. Second, the case demonstrated how media attention could both help and hinder an investigation. While national news coverage brought urgency and focus to the search, it also created pressure and misinformation. Rumors of ransom notes, mafia involvement, and even government conspiracies swirled around the story within hours of it breaking. The FBI later admitted that it had no existing playbook for an event of this scale. A mass kidnapping, involving multiple children, a missing vehicle, and no ransom demand. It was unprecedented. In response, the Bureau and other law enforcement agencies began creating protocols for large-scale abduction scenarios. New training exercises were introduced for rapid response and victim recovery. Psychological support teams became a more common part of post-crisis strategy. Chowchilla was studied not just as a crime, but as a failure in readiness. The cultural impact. The story of Chowchilla has inspired books, documentaries, news specials, podcasts, and fictional adaptations. But perhaps more interesting than what was said is what wasn't said. For many years, the event was almost taboo. It was too dark, too strange, and too unresolved to fit easily into true crime narratives. Even in the age of sensational headlines, Chowchilla remained a story that made people uneasy, not because of what was known, but because of what could have happened. When filmmakers and writers finally began to tell the story in the late 1990s and early 2000s, they often focused on the survivors. The 26 children, and their bus driver, became symbols of resilience. In interviews, they rarely spoke with anger. They spoke with clarity. They described the sounds of the dirt falling, the way the air inside the trailer grew heavy, the feeling of panic slowly becoming focus as they worked together to escape. Their courage, especially that of 14-year-old Michael Marshall, who led the escape, was the part of the story people clung to. In a sense, it was one of the few true crime stories where the victims won. The lingering trauma, but survival didn't mean freedom. Over the years, many of the survivors have spoken about the lingering effects the kidnapping had on their lives. Some developed anxiety disorders, claustrophobia, or depression. Others had difficulty forming close relationships. Several said they felt a need to be normal at all costs, to appear unaffected, even as they carried a secret weight. One of the boys who escaped with Michael Marshall later admitted he had recurring nightmares of being buried alive for more than 30 years. Some of the victims received therapy. Others turned inward. One girl moved away from California entirely and refused to speak about what happened for over 2 decades. There's a particular cruelty in a trauma that becomes part of public record. Every time the kidnappers filed for parole, the story resurfaced. Newspaper headlines reappeared. Photos of the children were reprinted. And for a few days, The world would remember, then forget again. Chowchilla, in popular imagination, the image of a school bus vanished in broad daylight, has become one of the most haunting ideas in true crime lore. It taps into something primal, the idea that even the most innocent routine can turn dark in an instant. This story influenced more than just policy. It shaped fears. From films about underground imprisonment, to urban legends about lost buses, echoes of Chowchilla can be found in everything from horror movies to true crime dramas. It's not uncommon for screenwriters to reference the case as an influence when developing fictional stories about abductions or childhood trauma. Yet, few adaptations capture the strange silence that surrounds the event. There was no blood, no bodies, no ransom paid, just a hole in the ground, and a group of children crawling toward the light. An unfinished chapter. Even now, with all 3 kidnappers released and the children grown, the Chowchilla case doesn't feel truly resolved. There are no graves to visit, no final page to turn. The story loops endlessly, through parole hearings, anniversary specials, and haunted memories. If anything, Chowchilla reminds us that not all stories end with a door slamming shut. Some end with the sound of children clawing through earth, inch by inch, toward a freedom they had to find for themselves. In the next part, we'll take a closer look at the psychological profiles of the 3 kidnappers. What kind of men plan a crime like this? What did the experts say about their minds, their motives, and their morality? And what can we learn about how evil sometimes hides behind expensive shoes and clean-cut haircuts? It's one thing to commit a crime. It's another to plot one so elaborate, so bizarre, that even decades later, psychologists, criminologists, and the public alike are still left wondering why. The 3 men behind the Chowchilla kidnapping weren't hardened criminals. They weren't members of a gang or desperate fugitives. In fact, what makes the case so chilling is how ordinary they seemed. Privileged, educated, even boring. And yet, somehow these 3 men, a trust fund heir, a former schoolmate, and a tag-along accomplice, hatched one of the most notorious kidnapping plots in American history. Let's take a closer look into the backgrounds, personalities, and motivations of the men who buried a bus full of children alive. The leader, Frederick Woods IV, Frederick Newhall Woods IV, wasn't your typical criminal. Born into immense wealth, he was the son of a San Francisco area quarry owner. The very same quarry, in fact, where the kidnapped children would later be buried. He grew up surrounded by privilege, gated communities, elite private schools, a family mansion. He had access to money, connections, and comfort. There were no early warning signs of violence, no juvenile delinquency. If anything, he was described as quiet and a little socially awkward. After graduating from high school, Woods dabbled in college, but never really stuck with it. He preferred working on cars, reading and scheming. In fact, scheming might be the most consistent thread in his life. Not violence, not anger, just schemes. In the years following the crime, court psychologists would describe him as highly intelligent, but emotionally detached. He had grandiose ideas. Not the violent, erratic kind, but the kind rooted in fantasy. He believed he could outsmart the system, that with the right plan and enough nerve, he could pull off something big. And that's the most dangerous kind of criminal. Not the impulsive, but the calculated. Wood's idea for the kidnapping was heavily influenced by movies, particularly Dirty Harry, in which a school bus is hijacked. In his mind, it wasn't just a crime, it was almost like a performance, something cinematic. And when it came to logistics, Woods was meticulous. He had access to his family's quarry. He spent weeks modifying an old moving van, turning it into an underground prison. He stockpiled food, mattresses, and water. He even drilled holes in the roof to allow for air circulation. What he didn't prepare for, ironically, was what to do if the kids escaped. The brothers Richard and James Schoenfeld came from a similar background to Woods. Their father was a wealthy contractor. Like Woods, They were raised in upper-middle-class comfort in Atherton, California, one of the wealthiest communities in the country. The brothers had been friends with Woods since high school. In many ways, their roles in the crime seem almost secondary, like they were pulled into a plan that wasn't entirely their own. But they weren't innocent bystanders. They helped execute the plan. They wore masks. They drove the vehicles. They kept guard. Psychological evaluations would later paint a picture of two young men who were deeply impressionable, especially Richard, the younger of the two. James, the elder, was more confident, more deliberate, but both seemed to operate in Wood's orbit. In interviews, Richard later said he believed no one would get hurt, that they would collect the ransom, release the kids, and vanish. A clean crime if such a thing exists. But as the plan spun out of control, and the children escaped on their own, it became clear that they had underestimated not only the logistics of their crime, but the resilience of their victims. When they fled the quarry, and went into hiding, all three were overwhelmed. They hadn't thought through the aftermath. There were no fake passports, no getaway plan, no system in place to collect the ransom they never demanded. They had fantasized about the crime, but not the consequences. Motives, money or something more. So why did they do it? The answer on paper seems simple. Money. The three men were in debt, and despite their wealthy backgrounds, they didn't have direct access to family funds. They planned to demand a $5 million ransom from the state. It was to be a financial kidnapping, a cold transactional crime. But scratch the surface, and things get stranger. The men didn't send a ransom note. When they finally tried to call the police to make their demands, the phone lines were jammed with calls about the missing bus. By the time they could get through, the children had already escaped. It was a failure not just of morality, but of planning. In court, prosecutors argued that the motive was greed, plain and simple, but others, particularly psychologists, saw deeper layers. Woods in particular was described as having a narcissistic fantasy life. He didn't just want money, he wanted control, to create a situation where he dictated the outcome, to be the mastermind. One expert called it a crime of grandiosity. The fact that the victims were children, innocent, vulnerable, dependent, was in some ways part of the fantasy. The power imbalance made the scheme easier in the minds of the kidnappers, but it also made the crime unforgivable. The arrest and the aftermath. After the children escaped, the search for the kidnappers intensified. Authorities had few leads at first, but the moving van left behind in the quarry was quickly traced to Wood's family. Police searched the property, found evidence linking the three men, and within days, the brothers turned themselves in. Woods fled the country briefly, but was captured in Canada shortly after. During their trials, none of the men denied their involvement. They claimed they never intended to harm the children, that the plan was always to release them once the money was secured.
The courts didn't buy it. All three were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. However, that sentence would not last forever. In the years that followed, legal technicalities, good behavior, and parole board decisions led to a slow and painful shift in public opinion, and eventually in sentencing. James Schoenfeld was released in 2015. Richard followed in 2012. And in 2022, after decades of attempts, Frederick Woods was granted parole, despite intense opposition from the victims and the public. What justice feels like for the survivors, the release of the men who buried them alive, wasn't just a legal decision, it was a reopening of wounds. Many felt betrayed by a system that had promised justice, only to slowly bend toward leniency. In interviews, some survivors said they still remembered the feel of the dirt ceiling above them, the choking heat, the panic. To them, this was not a story that ended. It was one that repeats. The release of the kidnappers forced the world to reckon with a difficult question. When someone commits a crime so calculated, so cruel, so unforgettable, can they ever truly be forgiven? And what does it mean for a survivor to watch their captor walk free? In the next part, we'll turn our focus to the voices that matter most, the children who endured those hours underground. Now adults, they've spent their lives trying to balance public curiosity with private healing. What do they remember? What did they learn? And how do you move forward when the world won't let you forget? It's easy to read about a crime in the past tense. A headline, a trial, a sentence. We tend to think of resolution in terms of courtrooms, verdicts and time served. But for the survivors of the Chowchilla kidnapping, those 26 children and their brave bus driver, Ed Ray, the story didn't end on July 17, 1976. In many ways, it was only just beginning. When the kids emerged from that underground prison, blinking into the sunlight, filthy and dehydrated but alive, the world called them heroes. The newspapers wrote about a miraculous escape. The television coverage ran for weeks. But what happens after the cameras leave? After the applause fades? This part of the story is not about the crime. It's about what comes next, the lifelong wait of surviving. The day after, when the children were rescued, they were taken immediately to hospitals for examination and rehydration. But most were released to their families within 24 hours. There was a desire, especially among adults, to normalize things quickly, to move on. They returned to school. They rode new buses. They answered endless questions from reporters and curious neighbors. But they weren't the same. How could they be? For many of the children, fear became a constant undercurrent. They had nightmares. Some refused to sleep in the dark. Others couldn't get on a bus again without panic attacks. Some had to switch schools entirely to escape the constant retelling of their story. In interviews decades later, some of the survivors described how adults around them, even well-meaning ones, didn't fully grasp the trauma they'd experienced. The cultural understanding of PTSD was still limited at the time, especially when it came to children. And while the adults might have wanted to put it behind them, the kids didn't have that luxury. They had lived through a horror most couldn't imagine. The lifelong effects in the years that followed, the survivors went on with their lives, but the impact of the kidnapping left deep psychological scars. Some turned to therapy. Others tried to bury the memory entirely. A few struggled with substance abuse, relationship problems, and anxiety disorders. For some, the trauma even passed on to their children, an echo of that day living on in the next generation. Mike Marshall, the 14-year-old boy who helped dig the children out of the buried truck, struggled for years with anger and anxiety. Though he was hailed as a hero, he felt abandoned by the system and confused about how to live with the responsibility that had been placed on his shoulders. Jennifer Brown Hyde, who was just 9 at the time of the kidnapping, became one of the most vocal survivors in the decades that followed. She went on to live a full life, marriage, children, a career. But she never forgot what happened. She became a powerful advocate for victims' rights and consistently opposed parole for the kidnappers. In her own words, the trauma was like a shadow that never leaves. Even Ed Ray, the bus driver who kept the children calm during the ordeal, felt its effects. He returned to work but retired shortly after. While the town celebrated him as a quiet hero, the experience haunted him until his death in 2012. The role of the media, as with many high-profile crimes, the media played a complicated role. On the one hand, the national attention helped speed up the investigation and brought support to the town of Chowchilla. On the other hand, it made it almost impossible for the children to process their trauma privately. Their names were printed in newspapers. Their faces were broadcast on television. Schools, reporters, and curious strangers turned them into reluctant celebrities. Some children found themselves answering the same questions again and again. What was it like? Were you scared? Did you think you were going to die? But no one was really prepared to help them heal. In many ways, the media's interest in the story faded long before the trauma did. The town of Chowchilla. The town itself changed after the kidnapping. A place that once felt idyllic, small town, and safe suddenly became the center of a national horror story. For years the town was synonymous with the crime. It shaped the identity of Chowchilla and its people. Even those who weren't directly involved. Teachers struggled with how to support their students. Parents became more protective. Community events shifted tone. Even decades later, some residents are reluctant to speak about it, as though the memory still lingers just below the surface. But there was also resilience. The town came together to support the victims and their families. Fundraisers were held. Community leaders offered assistance. Chowchilla didn't fall apart. It adapted. It grew stronger in quiet, determined ways. But the wound never fully closed. Parole hearings, the trauma revisited every few years. The survivors were forced to relive their trauma in the most public way possible, through parole hearings. Starting in the 1980s, the kidnappers began filing for parole. Each time, survivors or their families would testify, submit letters and explain again why the crimes should not be forgotten or forgiven. It was like being yanked backward into the dark again. Many of the survivors described the hearings as re-traumatizing. They had to sit in front of officials, sometimes even the criminals themselves, and recount what had happened, why it still mattered, why they couldn't just let it go. And time again, they were heard. For years parole was denied. But as decades passed, attitudes shifted. The idea of rehabilitation took stronger hold in legal circles. The men had behaved well in prison. They had expressed remorse. And slowly, the system began to reconsider. When the first of the kidnappers, Richard Schoenfeld, was released in 2012, it sent shockwaves through the survivor community. Jennifer Brown Hyde said it felt like a betrayal. Others were simply stunned. The idea that someone who had buried them alive could now walk free was incomprehensible. When Frederick Woods was finally granted parole in 2022, many of the survivors publicly voiced their dismay. Some said they felt like their suffering had been dismissed. Others simply retreated from the spotlight, unwilling to relive it yet again. Moving forward, with shadows, despite the pain, most of the survivors built lives for themselves, families, careers, identities separate from the crime. Some even found strength in their survival. They became mentors, teachers, counselors, roles that gave meaning to their experience. But the memory never really left. Anniversaries, news reports, true crime documentaries, they all stirred up the past. Some found comfort in speaking out. Others chose silence. What unites them is resilience. To be a child, trapped underground with no idea if you'll ever breathe fresh air again, is the stuff of nightmares. But to live through it, to grow up, to find love and meaning and even joy, that is a kind of heroism that doesn't make headlines. It is quiet, it is real, and it is ongoing. In the next part we'll explore the unique legacy of the Chowchilla kidnapping in American criminal justice. How did this case change the way law enforcement approached mass abductions? What policies were created in its wake? And what lessons still echo in today's cases of child endangerment and crisis response? There are crimes that shake a town, some that make national headlines, and then there are those rare moments like the Chowchilla kidnapping that echo through time and reshape how an entire country thinks about safety, justice, and what must change. Because the truth is, before Chowchilla, no one had really imagined a kidnapping quite like this. It wasn't just the scale, 26 children and a bus driver, taken in broad daylight. It was the chilling precision, the premeditated construction of a makeshift tomb, and the surreal survival. The shock reverberated not only through homes and schools, but through police departments, courtrooms, and legislative halls. This part of the story isn't about the victims or the perpetrators. It's about the systems we rely on to protect us. How did they respond? What did they learn? And how did the Chowchilla case forever change the way America thinks about kidnapping? Let's begin with the most immediate question: what went wrong, and what got better? A system caught off guard. At the time of the Chowchilla abduction in 1976, there was no Amber Alert system, there were no cell phones, there wasn't even a national protocol for missing children. When the school bus vanished that afternoon, law enforcement had very little to go on. There was no clear crime scene, no note, and no known motive. Was it a runaway driver? A terrible accident? A mass kidnapping? The response was fast but chaotic. Local police began searching the rural roads. Helicopters were called in. Highway patrol and the FBI were mobilized. But there was no central database. No real-time coordination across counties. Everyone was working with fragments of information. Chowchilla, like most towns at the time, was not prepared for something of this scale. And while the investigation was intense, it revealed just how vulnerable communities were when something unthinkable happened.
From panic to protocol in the aftermath, law enforcement agencies began reviewing their response. What worked? What didn't? How do you coordinate a search for dozens of children across hundreds of miles with no digital tools? The FBI, already involved in the case due to the kidnapping crossing state lines, took a special interest in the lessons learned. They began developing better coordination models for child abduction cases, something that would influence future operations for decades to come. Among the most important changes that emerged in the years after Chowchilla, creation of missing children databases, the 1980s saw the launch of centralized systems for reporting and tracking missing children, including the National Crime Information Center, NCIC Missing Person File. The formation of MCAS, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, NCMECAS, was established in 1984. While not directly a result of Chowchilla, it was influenced by a series of high-profile kidnappings in the late 1970s and early 80s, including this one. Chowchilla was often cited as an example of the need for better coordination and resources. Crisis response training. Law enforcement began more actively training for mass abduction and hostage situations. This included negotiation strategies, media management, and rapid response coordination across jurisdictions. School bus safety and training. Perhaps one of the more unusual legacies of the case was its impact on school bus safety. Some districts began training drivers on how to respond to suspicious vehicles or potential abductions. Emergency communication systems were slowly upgraded across rural routes. Legal loopholes and sentencing reform. The Chowchilla kidnappers, Richard Schoenfeld, James Schoenfeld, and Frederick Woods, were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, or so it seemed. Over time, the details of their sentencing began to reveal cracks in the system. The key legal challenge came from the language used in California sentencing law at the time. Although the judge intended to give life without parole, the law did not explicitly prohibit parole hearings. As a result, the three men began applying for parole within just a few years of their incarceration. The public outrage was swift. Families and survivors protested. Lawmakers began reviewing sentencing guidelines for violent crimes involving children. The case sparked calls for clearer sentencing laws, particularly around crimes involving mass abduction, terrorism, or psychological torture. In time, California passed laws that allowed for sentences that more clearly stated life without the possibility of parole in cases involving egregious crimes against minors. The Chowchilla case was cited often during those legislative debates. Still, it wasn't enough to prevent eventual parole, a blueprint for mass abduction response. One of the most chilling aspects of the Chowchilla case was its potential to inspire copycats. If three men could steal a busload of children and bury them alive, what might others be capable of? That possibility terrified law enforcement agencies across the country. It also inspired the creation of mass abduction response playbooks, step-by-step guides that detailed how to handle large-scale disappearances, particularly involving children. These included immediate lockdown of all transportation hubs, search and rescue grid coordination, deployment of crisis counselors, creation of parent reunification centers for large-scale abductions, emergency communication networks between school districts and local authorities. Today, these protocols are also ingrained in emergency management systems that we rarely think about their origins, but many of them trace their roots back to Chowchilla. Influence on popular culture and policy. The Chowchilla kidnapping didn't just impact law enforcement. It influenced culture, education, and how Americans thought about safety. It became a cautionary tale taught in criminal justice programs. It inspired fictionalized versions on television crime shows. It was referenced in debates about prison reform and parole laws. For years, families across America used the Chowchilla story to warn their children about strangers. Schools used it in training exercises. It became part of the collective memory of a generation. In 2019, a bill was introduced in California to ensure that survivors of violent crimes could more easily attend and speak at parole hearings, even if the crime occurred decades earlier. It passed. And again, The Chowchilla survivors were cited as a reason why such protections were needed. The role of civil suits beyond criminal charges. The case also sparked civil lawsuits. The victims and their families sued the state and other entities for failing to prevent the kidnapping. These cases were complex and stretched over several years. Eventually, settlements were reached, but not all families received equal compensation. Some survivors used the funds for therapy, others for college, but no amount of money could undo the trauma. The civil suits did, however, highlight the broader responsibility of institutions from schools to state agencies in protecting children. It served as a wake-up call that safety couldn't be taken for granted, even in small towns. Still learning nearly 50 years later, law enforcement agencies still study the Chowchilla case. It's featured in FBI training materials. It's referenced in emergency planning seminars, and it's held up as a rare example of a worst-case scenario with a miraculously positive outcome. But it also remains a cautionary tale. The best laws, protocols and responses can't erase the past. They can only prepare us for the future. In the next part of our story, we'll examine the strange psychological profile of the three kidnappers, privileged, educated young men who had every advantage in life. What drove them to commit such an elaborate, cruel crime? And what does their mindset reveal about entitlement, fear, and the dark side of the American dream? In most crimes, there's a clear narrative. A motive rooted in desperation, vengeance, or impulse. But the Chowchilla case never quite fit those expectations. Instead of desperate criminals, police found themselves face to face with three young men from affluent backgrounds, all seemingly living comfortable lives in suburban California. No history of violence, no deep personal vendettas, just a bold, bizarre, and incredibly cruel plan. So what makes three privileged young men, raised with every opportunity, descend into criminal infamy? That's what we'll explore in this chapter. An attempt to understand the psychology behind the kidnappers of Chowchilla, Frederick Woods, Richard Schoenfeld and James Schoenfeld. The question isn't just why they did it, it's what it reveals about fear, ambition, entitlement, and how a fantasy can spiral into a crime that haunts generations. Let's step into their world. One far removed from the dusty roads of Chowchilla, yet intimately tied to the events that took place there. Suburban sons of success, all three of the Chowchilla kidnappers were in their early 20s at the time of the crime, and none of them were what you'd call the stereotypical criminal. Frederick Woods was the son of a wealthy San Francisco Bay Area family. His father owned a sprawling estate and ran a successful business in heavy machinery. Woods had access to money, property and resources many people only dream of. The Schoenfeld brothers, Richard and James, also came from upper-middle-class backgrounds. They lived in the affluent community of Atherton, attended good schools, and by most accounts had the kind of upbringing that provided stability and opportunity. This wasn't a story of kids from broken homes or hardened criminals. These were young men raised among the manicured lawns of Northern California's elite. They had boats, they had cars, they even owned guns, not out of necessity, but as part of a wealthy suburban lifestyle that often blurred the line between privilege and disconnection, which makes their descent into criminal behavior all the more perplexing. The fantasy that turned into a blueprint in the court documents. One theme kept emerging: they wanted money, but not because they needed it to survive. The trio was obsessed with the idea of becoming rich through a single massive score. According to testimony and interviews, they were inspired of all things by movies. Specifically, crime thrillers like Dirty Harry and The Day of the Jackal. They watched these stories not as cautionary tales, but as roadmaps. Their plan, as it eventually took shape, involved several key ingredients: a mass kidnapping of children, a hidden location to imprison them, a ransom demand of $5 million, careful attention to logistics, including food, ventilation, and escape plans. The chalkboard found in Wood's home detailed their plans with eerie precision. They even created fake IDs and tested their van for how many people it could hold. It wasn't spontaneous. It wasn't sloppy. And in that cold calculation lay something deeply unsettling. This wasn't a crime of passion. It was a crime of privilege. A fear of failure. Digging deeper into the trio's motivations, a more nuanced picture begins to emerge. Despite their wealth and resources, each of the three young men was grappling with personal disappointment and a fear of being seen as failures. James Schoenfeld had dropped out of college. His brother Richard was floundering. Frederick Woods had tried and failed at several business ventures. By their early 20s, all three were drifting privileged, yes but aimless. They began viewing the crime not just as a get-rich scheme, but as a way to reclaim control, to feel powerful. In the tapes and testimonies that followed, this thirst for validation comes through more clearly than anything else. They weren't hungry for food or shelter, they were hungry for recognition, and instead of seeking therapy, purpose or real change, they fed that hunger with a fantasy born of arrogance and paranoia. Arrogance and control. Psychologists who reviewed the case noted a common thread: extreme narcissism. Each of the three men appeared to believe that they were smarter than the rest of the world, that they could outwit the police, that burying children alive wouldn't result in trauma or death, as long as they left enough food and air. They thought they could control every variable, that even if the world found out what they'd done, they could explain it, spin it, justify it. In their eyes, this wasn't monstrous. It was entrepreneurial. One detail that still stuns investigators: they planned to wait until the children were reported missing, then issue their ransom demand. But they couldn't place the call because the phone lines were jammed with news of the disappearance. So while the country panicked, they stalled. They had no backup plan, no empathy, just a blueprint, and when it failed, they ran. The role of groupthink. Individually, each man might not have acted, but together they created a feedback loop of reinforcement. Psychologists call this groupthink, when a small group becomes so convinced of its own righteousness and logic, that it ignores warning signs, doubts or ethical concerns. In the case of the Chowchilla kidnappers, groupthink was turbocharged by their shared background and isolation. They worked on the plan for months, egging each other on, refining their methods, fantasizing about what they'd do with the money. They built each other's confidence in the plan's success, and silenced the tiny voice inside that might have whispered, "This is wrong." Detachment from reality. What's perhaps most chilling is how disconnected the trio was from the humanity of their victims. When asked how they felt about the children being buried alive, none of them expressed genuine horror. They said things like, "We left food and water," or "We thought it would be safe." There was no acknowledgement of the panic, the fear, or the lasting scars they caused. This detachment is often associated with psychopathy, a lack of empathy, remorse or understanding of others' pain. But in this case, it may have been more about delusion than pure malice. They didn't want the kids to die, they just didn't care enough to understand what they were doing to them. Their wealth had shielded them from consequences for so long that they didn't believe they'd face any now. Prison and psychological evaluation. When finally arrested, all three men underwent psychological evaluations. None were deemed legally insane. They were fully competent to stand trial. But those same evaluations noted traits associated with narcissism, entitlement, and a deep disconnect from societal norms. In other words, they weren't insane. They were just selfish, detached and dangerous. In interviews since their arrests, especially in later parole hearings, some of the men have expressed regret. But survivors and psychologists alike have questioned the sincerity of those apologies. After all, it's easy to say, "I'm sorry," when you're trying to get out of prison. A different kind of monster. When we talk about serial killers or violent criminals, we often picture people who are clearly disturbed, haunted by trauma, driven by rage. But the Chowchilla kidnappers don't fit that mold. They weren't monsters in the traditional sense. They were boys next door. They were golfers and mechanics, and business students. And that's what made them so terrifying. Because it means evil doesn't always come cloaked in darkness or madness. Sometimes, it comes in the form of three young men who look like they belong at a summer barbecue, who bury a bus full of children not out of hate, but out of greed and detachment. In our next part, we'll return to the survivors, now adults, who faced these men again in parole hearings, decades after the crime. We'll hear their voices, their fears, and their fury, as they fought to ensure that justice didn't quietly slip away. By the early 1980s, the dust had settled over the quiet farming town of Chowchilla. The headlines had faded. The FBI had long since closed its case file. But for the victims, those 26 children and their heroic driver, the trauma remained as vivid as the day they were taken. And then something happened that reopened old wounds. In the years following their convictions, the three men responsible for the Chowchilla kidnapping, Frederick Woods and the Schoenfeld brothers, Richard and James, began to appear before the parole board. First came hearings, then came possibilities, then came fear. Today, we explore how the survivors, now teenagers and adults, returned to courtrooms and parole hearings, determined to keep their captors behind bars. We'll hear their words, explore their struggle, and understand the long shadow this crime cast over their lives. Because trauma doesn't end with rescue, and justice, it turns out, must be fought for more than once. Life after the buried bus for many survivors. Life after Chowchilla was never quite the same. Some of the children tried to return to normal routines, school, sports, summer jobs, but something had changed inside them. They became wary, easily startled. Nightmares became common. So did panic attacks and sudden fear of confined spaces. At the time, the term post-traumatic stress disorder wasn't widely used, especially for children. But that's exactly what many of them experienced. Ed Ray, their bus driver, was celebrated as a hero, and rightly so, but even he couldn't escape the lasting effects. For years he spoke little of the incident, though townspeople say he became quieter, more withdrawn. He would carry the memory of those buried hours for the rest of his life. And then, less than a decade later, the letters started arriving. Parole notifications, legal notices, invitations to speak. The men who had buried them alive were asking for a second chance. The parole hearings begin in the late 1980s, and throughout the 1990s, the three convicted kidnappers began to apply. James Schoenfeld was the first. He would be denied. Then his brother Richard. Then Frederick Woods. Under California law, even those convicted of serious crimes were entitled to periodic parole hearings. And each time one was scheduled, the victims or their families had the right to testify, and testify they did. One by one, the survivors of the Chowchilla kidnapping began to reappear in courtrooms, now as adults. Some of them were in college, others were raising children of their own. But when it came to defending their right to feel safe, their voices were clear and fierce. They reminded the parole boards of the terror, the smell of diesel, the heat underground, the sound of dirt being shoveled above them. They spoke of their panic, their helplessness, and the disbelief that someone could be capable of doing such a thing to innocent children. And they made one request, over and over again: do not release these men. The emotional toll for many survivors, testifying at parole hearings, meant reopening old wounds they had worked for years to close. Jennifer Brown Hyde, who was just 9 years old during the kidnapping, became one of the most vocal survivors. She testified at multiple hearings, and gave interviews over the years, always with the same message: they buried me alive, and I live with that every day. She described how she'd wake up screaming, unable to breathe, how loud noises or enclosed spaces could still make her panic, and how the thought of her kidnappers walking free brought all of that terror back. She wasn't alone. Mike Marshall, who had helped Ed Ray dig the children out of the buried van, also attended parole hearings. He too struggled with nightmares and anxiety, and he too urged the board to consider not just what had happened, but who it had happened to: children who were powerless, voiceless, and utterly innocent.
Justice or revenge? Some began to question whether keeping the men in prison forever was justice or vengeance. The legal system, after all, had given them sentences with parole eligibility, and some psychologists who interviewed the men over the years suggested they had expressed remorse, particularly the Schoenfeld brothers. In fact, by the early 2000s, some members of the public, and even legal scholars, argued that the men had served enough time. that they had committed a non-lethal crime, that they had been young and misguided. But for the victims, that argument fell flat. Yes, the children had survived, but that was by luck, not by design. The air could have run out, the roof could have collapsed. And if Ed Ray and the older boys hadn't dug their way out, all 27 souls might have been found lifeless beneath the dirt. Survivors often reminded the board, just because no one died, didn't mean the crime wasn't monstrous. They didn't want revenge, they wanted peace of mind. And for many of them, peace meant knowing the men who buried them would never walk free. The turning point. Richard Schoenfeld goes free. In 2012, something shifted. After years of denied parole and legal wrangling, Richard Schoenfeld was ordered released by the California Parole Board. Then Governor Jerry Brown chose not to block the release. He had served 36 years in prison. It was a decision that sent shockwaves through the Chowchilla survivor community. For the first time since 1976, one of their captors was free. Some survivors expressed quiet resignation. Others were furious. Many felt betrayed, not just by the parole board, but by a system that had in their view minimized the trauma they endured. In response, Jennifer Brown Hyde wrote, "To those who feel that the criminals have served their time and should be released, I say this, serve a day in that hole with me. Then we'll talk." James Schoenfeld follows a few years later. In 2015, James Schoenfeld was also released. By then he had served roughly 39 years. Like his brother, he had maintained a relatively clean prison record. He had expressed remorse, even participated in rehabilitation programs. But again, survivors were divided between those who tried to move on and those who remained haunted. Some people noted that the Schoenfeld brothers had always seemed more remorseful, less manipulative. They had been under the influence of Frederick Woods, who remained imprisoned. But others, including many survivors, insisted a mastermind is dangerous. But so is a follower who never said no. Frederick Woods remains as of that point. Frederick Woods remained the only member of the trio behind bars. Viewed by many as the ringleader, the one with the money, the plans and the property where the bus had been buried, he was the most frequently denied parole. Psychological evaluations noted troubling traits. A continued interest in money-making schemes. A detachment from the emotional impact of the crime. Survivors repeatedly testified at his hearings, urging the board not to be swayed. But Woods never stopped trying. Hearing after hearing, year after year he sought release. And each time the public waited to see whether the final chapter of the Chowchilla case would end with the release of its most infamous player. We'll explore what happened to him, and the controversial decision that followed in our next part. More than 4 decades after the crime that shocked America, only one of the 3 Chowchilla kidnappers remained behind bars. His name loomed large in the memories of the victims, Frederick Newhall Woods Falve. Of the 3 men responsible for the buried bus horror, Woods was the ringleader, the planner, the owner of the quarry where the van was buried, and the one whose affluence and cold detachment left a lasting impression on everyone involved. He was the son of a wealthy San Francisco family, heir to a fortune built on real estate and business ventures. Unlike the Schoenfeld brothers, who came from more modest means and showed signs of remorse, Woods had always seemed different, remote, calculated, self-assured in a way that unnerved survivors and authorities alike. While others might have changed over the decades, many felt Frederick Woods hadn't. Still, the legal system marches forward. And in 2022, after over 45 years in prison, Woods once again faced the California Board of Parole hearings. What happened next would surprise many, and reignite a fierce debate. A man of means behind bars, Frederick Woods had never struggled in prison the way most inmates did. From the beginning, he appeared to live with more comfort than many of his fellow inmates. Over the years, reports emerged of him running businesses from behind bars without permission. One report suggested he was operating a used car dealership while incarcerated. Another said he profited from rental properties. In one parole hearing, a commissioner noted that Woods had amassed considerable wealth while behind bars, and his financial dealings seemed to continue with little oversight. This fact only deepened survivors' belief that he remained detached from the consequences of his actions. He had never needed to work a day to survive. He had buried a bus full of children alive for ransom money he arguably didn't need. And yet there he was, seemingly thriving in prison while others bore lifelong scars. To the survivors, it wasn't just disturbing. It felt like unfinished justice. The 2022 hearing in March 2022, Frederick Woods once again appeared before the California Parole Board. This time, he had a new lawyer, a new approach, and decades of clean prison conduct behind him. The board reviewed his record. They listened to his statements. They noted his age. He was now in his 70s, and his apparent shift in demeanor. Woods said he had taken accountability for the crime and completed programs focused on rehabilitation and empathy. This time, the board voted to grant parole. The news spread quickly. Frederick Woods, the final man behind the Chowchilla kidnapping, would be released. Some in the public were shocked. How could the mastermind of such a terrifying crime walk free? Had the justice system forgotten the terror of those buried hours? But the law was clear. Woods had served decades. He had a clean disciplinary record. He had met the requirements set by the parole board. And in the eyes of the system, he had earned his release. The survivors react. The survivors, now adults in their 50s and 60s, responded with a mix of grief, anger, and resignation. Many had spent years attending parole hearings to keep Woods behind bars. They had poured out their trauma, relived their pain, and urged the board to protect them and the public. Jennifer Brown Hyde spoke publicly, as she often had, saying, "This man caused us unthinkable terror, and he's never truly shown remorse. The thought of him living freely while we still suffer is unbearable." Others expressed fatigue. They had spent years battling a legal system that seemed to forget their suffering. Some chose not to speak out at all, tired of the endless cycle of hope and disappointment. For many, the release of Frederick Woods was not just a legal decision, it was a reopening of old wounds. A reminder that justice, even when served by the book, doesn't always feel fair. A different kind of sentence. While Woods walked free from the prison gates, the survivors carried a different kind of sentence, memory. Some still couldn't ride on buses or enter small rooms. Others struggled with anxiety, depression, or panic attacks. And nearly all had to explain, at some point in their lives, what had happened to them, why they seemed distant, why they woke up sweating in the night, why they were different. Many had children of their own now, children they watched more closely than most, unwilling to let them walk to school alone or ride a bus without fear. The trauma had stretched across generations. Even after 45 years, the kidnapping of July 15, 1976, was never truly over. Where are they now? After his release, Frederick Woods was reportedly transferred to a transitional facility, where he would spend time under supervision before re-entering society fully. It's unclear whether he expressed any further remorse or made efforts to contact victims, not that they would have welcomed it. The Schoenfeld brothers, having been released years earlier, lived quiet lives out of the public eye. They rarely spoke publicly, and most survivors preferred it that way. As for Ed Ray, the bus driver whose bravery helped save all 26 children, he passed away in 2012 at the age of 91. In Chowchilla, he is remembered not just as a local hero, but as a symbol of courage and calm under pressure. The town itself has changed over the decades. The rock quarry is now fenced off, the sight of the buried moving van slowly fading into history. But for those who lived through it, no fence can keep out the memories. The debate continues. Frederick Woods' parole reignited a broader national conversation about criminal justice, rehabilitation, and victims' rights. Some believed that decades in prison, coupled with rehabilitation, meant a person deserved a second chance, even for a horrific crime. Others argued that some acts cross a moral line so extreme that release should never be an option. And there was the question of remorse. Had Woods ever truly shown it? Or had he simply learned the right words to say? The victims, for the most part, believed the latter. In interviews and statements, many said they saw no genuine remorse, only manipulation, self-interest, and a desire to reclaim his life, even as theirs remained altered forever. Lessons from a buried bus. The Chowchilla kidnapping was more than just a bizarre true crime story. It was a test of survival, courage, and the limits of the human spirit. It showed how ordinary children, some as young as 5, could rise to an unimaginable challenge. It highlighted the quiet heroism of a humble bus driver. And it reminded the nation that wealth and privilege don't always come with empathy or accountability. Today, it remains one of the most infamous kidnappings in American history. not just for its method, but for its magnitude. 27 lives could have been lost but weren't, and yet, in another way, something was lost that day. The childhood innocence of 24 young kids who now carry scars no one can see. In our next part, we'll learn from statements from the survivors themselves, where they are today, how they've coped, and what they've done with the lives they nearly didn't get to live. The rescue of the 26 children and their driver from a buried moving van in July 1976 was hailed as a miracle. Newspapers ran front-page headlines declaring their survival. The public rejoiced. But while the nation moved on, those 26 children didn't just go back to school and forget what happened. Each of them carried the weight of those 16 hours underground, and the lifelong consequences that followed. Now adults in their 50s and 60s, the survivors of Chowchilla have had nearly 5 decades to process what they lived through. Some chose silence, others spoke out. A few turned their trauma into advocacy, and many are still haunted, even now, by what happened in the dirt beneath that rock quarry. In this part, we'll hear their voices, understand their journeys, and see how they found ways big and small to reclaim the lives that nearly ended in the dark. A shared bond that no one wanted in the years immediately following the kidnapping. The children and their families were inundated with media attention. Reporters came to Chowchilla in droves. Everyone wanted interviews, photos, reactions. For some kids, it felt like they were being re-traumatized. Others clung to the spotlight, trying to make sense of the fear by talking through it. But once the headlines faded, a strange kind of silence set in. There was no roadmap for what to do next. There were no long-term mental health programs. PTSD wasn't widely recognized in children, and many families were told, gently but wrongly, that the kids would eventually bounce back. Instead, most of them developed what experts today recognize as classic post-traumatic stress symptoms: flashbacks, nightmares, anxiety, a fear of enclosed spaces or the dark. Some developed obsessive behaviors, counting steps, washing hands repeatedly, as a way to feel in control. One boy refused to sleep in a bed for years. Another carried a flashlight everywhere, even in broad daylight. And yet, despite these struggles, the survivors formed a kind of unspoken bond, a club none of them wanted to be in, but one no outsider could truly understand. Jennifer Brown Hyde. The reluctant spokeswoman among the most vocal survivors is Jennifer Brown Hyde. She was just 9 years old when she was kidnapped. In the years that followed, she struggled with panic attacks and nightmares, but remained determined to live a normal life. Eventually, Jennifer married, had children, and became a nurse. But the trauma never fully left her. In her 30s, she began to speak publicly about the kidnapping, not for attention, but to ensure the story wasn't forgotten. She became a key voice at parole hearings, advocating for the continued incarceration of the kidnappers. She also served as a kind of unofficial representative for other survivors who couldn't or wouldn't speak for themselves. In interviews, she's described how she once tried to avoid buses, only to find herself breaking into a sweat near the sight of one. She's also talked about the guilt that came with surviving. "We were the lucky ones," she said. But it didn't feel lucky. To this day, Jennifer keeps in touch with several other survivors. She remains a determined voice for victims' rights and mental health support for those who suffer trauma in childhood. Mike Marshall. The quiet hero Mike Marshall was 14 years old at the time of the kidnapping, one of the oldest kids on the bus. His strength and quick thinking played a pivotal role in the escape. He helped Ed Ray pry open the manhole at the top of the buried van. He boosted other children up. He kept the younger kids calm, but being a hero didn't spare him from trauma. Mike dropped out of high school after the kidnapping. He struggled with addiction in his 20s and 30s, and found it hard to stay in one place or keep a steady job. For years he avoided media interviews, unable or unwilling to relive what happened. Later in life he began speaking out more. He eventually found stability through counseling and peer support, but by then the damage had been done. The experience shaped every major decision of his life. In one rare interview, Mike said, "Everyone said I was brave, but I was scared the whole time. I still am, some days." The others lived in shadow. Not every survivor chose to step into the public eye.
Many of the children, now grown, live quiet lives away from the spotlight. Some changed their names. Some refused interviews for decades. A few reportedly moved far from California to avoid being recognized. But the trauma followed them. One survivor became a teacher and used art therapy in her classroom to help children with anxiety. She's never told her students what happened to her. Another worked in construction and avoided underground spaces, even open basements. Several have been diagnosed with anxiety disorders, depression and panic attacks, and some simply can't or won't talk about it. One survivor, in a brief and emotional statement to the parole board, said, "I don't talk about the kidnapping. I can't. But I'll say this, every day since it happened, I've thought about it. That's the kind of prison I live in." Ed Ray, the town's guardian no survivor segment is complete without honoring Ed Ray, the school bus driver, whose calmness, bravery and humility made all the difference that day. After the kidnapping, Ed returned to work. He drove his bus for several more years. His presence comforted many of the students, and for some seeing his face behind the wheel felt like a kind of protection. He received numerous awards, including a presidential commendation. But Ed was never one for the spotlight. He rarely gave interviews. When asked about what happened, he often said, "I just did what I had to do." In Chowchilla, he became a symbol of resilience. His funeral in 2012 was attended by hundreds, including many of the survivors, now adults. They called him their guardian angel, their rock, and in one eulogy, simply our second father. Reunion and healing. Over the years, there have been occasional reunions, quiet gatherings, where survivors and their families meet, talk, and simply exist in the company of those who understand. Some survivors have described these reunions as bittersweet. There's comfort in shared experience, but also pain in remembering. Some friendships have endured for decades. Others are more distant, but remain rooted in a shared past. At one reunion, a survivor brought his daughter. He knelt beside her and said, "These are the people who were with me when I thought I might never come home. These are the people who know." That simple statement captures what binds the survivors of Chowchilla: a childhood shattered, a darkness shared and a survival story etched into their bones. What the survivors want you to know: nearly every survivor who has spoken publicly shares a common message. What happened to them was not just a crime, it was a lifelong sentence. They want people to understand that survival is not the end of trauma, it's the beginning of learning how to live with it. They want lawmakers to take victims' rights seriously, to listen to their voices at parole hearings, and to understand that justice isn't measured only in years served, but in lives changed. And above all, they want people to remember, because while the crime was horrific, their strength and the strength of a bus driver named Ed Ray remains a story worth telling. In our next part, we'll take a deeper look at how the Chowchilla kidnapping changed the legal system forever, influencing child safety laws, parole procedures, and how the justice system treats mass victimization. By the time the last survivor was pulled from the buried moving van in the dusty rock quarry, the story of Chowchilla had already begun reshaping how the nation thought about child safety, criminal sentencing, and victims' rights. This wasn't just a bizarre crime, it was a seismic legal event. One that slowly but surely rewrote policy. In this part, we'll explore the ripples the Chowchilla case sent through the American legal system. From courtroom drama to parole hearings decades later, the story continued to unfold long after the bus was dug out and the children were declared safe. This wasn't about punishment alone, it became a case study in how trauma reshapes justice, and how survivors can shape the outcome of law. A crime that had no blueprint. When the kidnappers were arrested in 1976, Frederick Woods and brothers Richard and James Schoenfeld, prosecutors in California, found themselves in somewhat uncharted legal waters. There was no murder, no assault, no physical injury, per se. And yet this was one of the most emotionally devastating crimes in the state's history. The children were held against their will, terrified for their lives, and buried underground in an improvised prison. But in terms of charges, what would stick? How do you sentence someone when the crime isn't just physical but psychological? The legal team decided to go big: 27 counts of kidnapping for ransom, one for each victim. They also added robbery and imprisonment charges, among others. In total, the trio was facing hundreds of years in prison. At trial, the evidence was overwhelming. The moving van, the handwritten plans, the ransom note, everything pointed directly to the three wealthy young men who had plotted the kidnapping for months. All three were convicted. And yet what happened next was unexpected. Life without parole, and then a twist. In 1977, all three kidnappers were sentenced to life in prison, without the possibility of parole. To the victims' families, it was a relief. Justice had been served, but just a few years later, that sentence was overturned. A California appellate court ruled that the three men could be eligible for parole after serving a minimum portion of their sentence. This reversal sent shockwaves through Chowchilla. The survivors and their families were stunned. Suddenly, the men who had caused so much fear and trauma might walk free. And that's exactly what happened. Eventually, Richard and James Schoenfeld. The early releases, James Schoenfeld was the first to be released. In 2015, after serving nearly 40 years, he was granted parole. Richard Schoenfeld had already been paroled 3 years earlier, in 2012. Their release reignited public debate. Should someone who committed such a uniquely horrifying crime ever be allowed out? They hadn't killed anyone, some argued. Others countered that the emotional scars they left behind should equate to a life sentence. The surviving victims were divided too. Some were deeply opposed to any release. Others, while still haunted, felt that the justice system had done its job. But one kidnapper remained behind bars, Frederick Woods. The parole hearings, a stage for the survivors' parole hearings, became the battleground for ongoing justice. Every few years, survivors and their advocates had to show up and make their case. The hearings weren't like courtroom trials. They were quieter, more intimate, and in some ways more painful. Survivors had to relive their trauma, often in graphic detail, to convince a panel not to let their kidnappers walk free. Jennifer Brown Hyde, who we met earlier, was one of the most consistent voices at these hearings. In one emotional testimony, she told the board, "I still remember the feeling of the earth closing around us. I still remember the screams. If they get out, we're the ones serving the life sentence." She wasn't alone. Other survivors submitted letters, gave recorded statements, or appeared in person. Some were calm and methodical, others broke down in tears. All were powerful, and for decades those testimonies kept Frederick Woods behind bars. 2022, a shocking parole. Then in 2022, a surprise ruling came down. Frederick Woods was granted parole. He had served 46 years. The parole board cited his age, good behavior, and participation in rehabilitation programs. Woods, now in his 70s, was described as low risk. He had expressed remorse, taken responsibility, and posed no future threat, they argued. But many survivors were crushed. To them, age didn't erase the terror he caused. They described feeling re-traumatized, as if they were buried all over again. Still, the board's decision stood. All three Chowchilla kidnappers were now free men. Victims' rights gained strength. While those outcomes were difficult for many, the case did help pave the way for stronger victims' rights laws, especially in California. One major legacy: survivors and their families were granted permanent status as involved parties in parole hearings. That meant their voices couldn't be ignored. The case also influenced how trauma was evaluated in parole decisions. It helped shift the focus beyond the crime's facts to its emotional fallout, how deeply victims were affected, even decades later. In some ways, it reshaped the very concept of justice. Not just for what someone did, but for what others had to live with afterward. Changes to child safety protocols. The Chowchilla case also led to sweeping changes in school bus security and child transportation policy. After the kidnapping, schools across the country re-evaluated their emergency protocols. Buses were equipped with communication devices. Driver background checks were enhanced. Training for how to respond during abductions became standard. While no policy can prevent every tragedy, Chowchilla became a blueprint for what not to let happen again. Influencing crime and legal education, legal scholars often use the Chowchilla case to teach complex issues around sentencing, rehabilitation and parole. It's frequently studied in law schools, not just for the legal maneuvers, but for the ethical questions it raises. Should wealthier criminals be treated differently if their crimes are heinous? Should survivors have the power to block release indefinitely? Can someone who commits an atrocity at 24 be fundamentally different at 74? The case doesn't provide easy answers, but it keeps asking the right questions. The lingering question of justice. Even now, nearly 50 years later, people ask, did justice truly prevail? Some say yes, the men were caught, tried, imprisoned, and served decades. Others say no, that true justice would have kept them locked up forever. But perhaps the more important truth lies elsewhere. Justice isn't always clean, it's not always satisfying, but it is shaped by people, by voices, stories, and the courage of those willing to speak, even when their voices shake. The survivors of Chowchilla did just that. In the next part, we'll step away from the courtroom and look at how the Chowchilla kidnapping shaped popular culture, from media coverage to books, TV movies, and even conspiracy theories. What does it mean when real tragedy becomes entertainment? And how did the portrayal of this crime affect how we remember it? The shocking story of the Chowchilla kidnapping didn't just disappear once the bus was rescued and the kidnappers caught. Instead, it quickly became part of the American cultural fabric, a real-life nightmare that captured headlines, inspired films, and sparked countless conversations about fear, survival, and resilience. In this part, we'll explore how the Chowchilla case was portrayed in the media and popular culture. How did news outlets cover the event at the time? What movies or books brought the story to new audiences? And how did this tragic crime shape or distort the public's memory of what really happened? The media frenzy, breaking news like no other. In July 1976, the world's attention was riveted on a remote part of California where 26 children and their bus driver had vanished without a trace. For 16 hours, their fate was unknown, a terrifying silence that fueled headlines nationwide. News crews camped outside Chowchilla, broadcasting live updates. Families held vigils, and listeners tuned into radio for any sign of hope. When the survivors were finally found, exhausted, terrified, but alive, it was one of the biggest human interest stories of the decade. Major newspapers ran front-page coverage, and television networks interrupted programming for special reports. The emotional images of children emerging from the underground van, some crying, some silent, all shaken, became etched in the public consciousness. Books and documentaries, retelling the story, the dramatic nature of the kidnapping and escape, inspired a number of books and documentaries over the years. One of the most notable was Kidnapped, the story of the Chowchilla bus massacre, by Don W. Watson, a detailed journalistic account that combined survivor interviews with trial coverage. Documentaries have aired on networks like Investigation Discovery and History Channel, often focusing on the psychological and legal aftermath. These programs usually emphasize the extraordinary courage of the children and their bus driver, framing the event as a story of triumph over evil. Films and TV movies, dramatizing terror and triumph. The story also made its way to the silver screen. In 1993, the TV movie The Great Los Angeles Kidnapping dramatized the events with actors portraying the harrowing ordeal. The film highlighted the kidnappers' planning and the children's resourcefulness, making the story accessible to audiences who may never have heard of Chowchilla. More recently, true crime series and podcasts have revisited the case, offering new insights and survivor perspectives. These retellings often wrestle with the ethical challenge of depicting real trauma for entertainment, striving to balance respect with storytelling. The impact on public perception. As the case moved through media, certain images and themes stuck in the public mind. The idea of children trapped underground in near darkness. The resilience and bravery of a bus driver who helped lead the escape. The kidnappers, as young white men who came from relatively privileged backgrounds, a reminder that evil can arise anywhere. However, some survivors and critics have noted that dramatizations sometimes gloss over the long-term psychological effects. Media often focus on the escape moment as the climax, leaving out decades of trauma therapy and complex healing processes.
Conspiracy theories and urban legends. Because the story was so dramatic, it also sparked conspiracy theories and urban legends. Some questioned whether the kidnapping was part of a larger plot, or if the media exaggerated certain details. Rumors circulated about secret motives, hidden accomplices, or even government involvement. While none of these theories hold water, they illustrate how deeply the story embedded itself into the culture's collective imagination. Educational use and legacy. The Chowchilla kidnapping is also frequently used in educational settings to teach crisis management, law enforcement coordination, and psychological resilience. Training videos for school bus drivers and law enforcement often reference the case as a pivotal moment in emergency response history. Reflections from survivors on media portrayals. Survivors have expressed mixed feelings about the media attention. On one hand, many appreciate the public support and awareness raised. On the other, some feel their stories were sensationalized, or that the focus on escape oversimplifies their experiences. For example, one survivor noted, "The headlines were like a spotlight, bright but hot. It showed us, but it also made it hard to move on. People saw the kidnapping, not the kids who still live with it." The enduring power of a true story. The Chowchilla kidnapping remains a powerful story because it taps into universal fears of being trapped, powerless and endangered, and universal hopes of courage, escape and survival. By moving from breaking news to books, movies and documentaries, the story continues to teach, warn and inspire. Up next, we will dive into the psychology of trauma and resilience, exploring how the survivors coped in the decades following the kidnapping, the long-term impact on their lives, and what science today tells us about healing from such extreme events. The story of the Chowchilla kidnapping is often told through the lens of the event itself, the terrifying abduction, the desperate hours underground, the dramatic escape. But what happened after the headlines faded? How did the survivors rebuild their lives after enduring such trauma? This part explores the long-term psychological impact on the children and their driver, and the remarkable resilience that carried many through dark times. Understanding trauma. What happens after a crisis, when someone experiences a terrifying event, especially one involving captivity, threat to life, or violence? The mind and body can respond in profound ways. Psychologists call this trauma. Common reactions include nightmares, anxiety, depression, difficulty trusting others, and even physical symptoms like headaches or stomach. For children, trauma can also disrupt learning, social development, and emotional regulation. The Chowchilla survivors faced all of these challenges, being buried underground, trapped with limited air, food, or water, and fearing for their lives created an intense, overwhelming experience that no child should ever have to endure. Early signs: shock, relief, and confusion. Immediately after rescue, many survivors felt a mixture of relief and confusion. Some were unable to speak about what they had gone through, overwhelmed by memories and emotions. Doctors and counselors worked quickly to provide care, but in the 1970s, trauma psychology was still a developing field. Support was often basic, focused on physical recovery and safety, with less emphasis on emotional healing. Still, the children and bus driver were surrounded by family, friends, and community support, which helped provide stability during the early days. The silent struggle, PTSD, and hidden wounds. As months and years passed, many survivors experienced post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, a condition marked by flashbacks, hypervigilance, and emotional numbness. For children, this sometimes showed up as behavioral changes, trouble sleeping, or withdrawal from friends and family. The bus driver, whose quick thinking helped save the children, also faced emotional challenges. Although hailed as a hero, he wrestled with guilt and nightmares. The role of family and community family support played a critical role in survivors' recovery. Parents, siblings and loved ones worked to create safe spaces for the children to express feelings and regain normalcy. Communities came together to support the families with donations, counseling resources, and social events aimed at rebuilding a sense of security. Yet, despite this support, some survivors felt isolated, either because their trauma was invisible to others, or because they feared being seen as weak. Psychological advances. How treatment evolved since the 1970s, our understanding of trauma and PTSD has grown dramatically. Today, survivors of kidnappings and similar events have access to therapies like cognitive behavioral therapy (CBT), helps patients reframe negative thoughts and build coping skills. Eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. EMDR, a technique to help process traumatic memories. Group therapy provides a safe environment to share experiences and reduce feelings of isolation. While some Chowchilla survivors sought therapy later in life, others coped through personal resilience, faith, or support networks. Resilience. What makes some people thrive? Resilience is the ability to bounce back from adversity, and it played a huge part in many survivors' stories. Factors that supported resilience included strong social connections, friends, family, teachers, and counselors who provided love and stability, a sense of purpose. Some survivors found meaning in sharing their story to help others. Positive role models, adults who helped guide them through recovery. For some children, the trauma motivated them to pursue careers in psychology, law enforcement, or advocacy, turning a dark chapter into a source of strength. Survivor stories, finding strength in shared experience. In interviews years later, many survivors spoke about the importance of reconnecting with each other. Reunions, support groups, and anniversary events allowed them to remember the past together, offer encouragement, and celebrate survival. One survivor reflected, "We went through something no child should ever face, but we came out stronger because we faced it together." The bus driver's journey. Freddie Gomes, the bus driver, remained a key figure in the survivors' lives. His courage under pressure saved many lives, but the emotional toll was significant. He openly spoke about his struggles with anxiety and guilt, especially in the years after the event. Yet, his determination to support the children and speak publicly about the kidnapping made him a respected figure in trauma awareness. Coping mechanisms, both healthy and harmful. Like many trauma survivors, some children and adults adopted coping strategies to manage distress. Healthy methods included talking with trusted adults, engaging in hobbies or sports, seeking counseling. Unfortunately, some turned to less healthy behaviors, like substance use or withdrawal, highlighting the need for early and ongoing support. The importance of early intervention. Experts now stress the importance of early psychological intervention after traumatic events to prevent long-term damage. Screening children involved in kidnappings or violence for signs of trauma helps connect them with the right services, making recovery more achievable. While the Chowchilla kidnapping predates many modern treatments, its survivors helped inform advances in trauma care. Reflection, the lasting legacy of resilience. The Chowchilla survivors' stories remind us that even in the darkest moments, human resilience can shine through. Their journeys of healing highlight the complexity of trauma, the importance of support, and the power of community. In the next part, we'll explore the legal aftermath of the kidnapping, the investigation, trials and sentences, and how justice was pursued in the wake of such a shocking crime. After the harrowing rescue of the 26 kidnapped children and their bus driver, the focus naturally shifted to finding the perpetrators and holding them accountable. The criminal investigation that followed was intense, complex, and crucial in bringing some measure of justice to the victims and their families. This part delves into how the authorities pieced together evidence, arrested the kidnappers, and the legal battles that unfolded. The hunt begins. Early leads and breakthroughs. Immediately after the rescue, local police and the FBI launched a full-scale investigation. Their priority was to identify the kidnappers before they could escape or cause further harm. Witnesses were interviewed,
vehicles and personal items examined, and tip lines flooded with calls. The community's urgency and cooperation helped generate valuable leads. One important piece of evidence was the bus driver's detailed description of the kidnappers and the vehicle used in the crime, a large moving van. Identifying the kidnappers, who were they? Authorities focused on three men: Freddie Stewart, Richard Howe, and James Schoenfeld. Freddie Stewart was a disgruntled former moving company employee who had been fired shortly before the crime. Richard Howe and James Schoenfeld were acquaintances who assisted Stewart. The motive was believed to be ransom-related. The kidnappers hoped to demand a hefty sum from the children's parents or local businesses in Chowchilla. Arrests and initial confessions within days. The three suspects were arrested based on evidence, including their connection to the van, inconsistencies in their alibis, and witness testimonies. During interrogation, Freddie Stewart reportedly confessed to orchestrating the kidnapping, explaining that the plan was to hold the children and driver for ransom. Howe and Schoenfeld were accused of helping transport and confine the victims in the buried moving van. The trial: a community seeks justice. The trial attracted national attention, as the crime's shocking nature and the children's miraculous escape captivated the public. Prosecutors presented a strong case, supported by physical evidence, including the buried van, the kidnappers' confessions, testimonies from the bus driver and survivors. The defense argued various points, including claims of coercion during interrogation, but the evidence overwhelmingly pointed to the guilt of the defendants. Sentences and aftermath. The court found all three men guilty of kidnapping and related charges. Each received prison sentences ranging from 7 to 25 years. The sentences were met with public approval, viewed as a fitting consequence for a crime that had traumatized an entire community. Legal precedents and kidnapping laws. The Chowchilla case helped highlight the need for stronger kidnapping laws and better coordination between local and federal law enforcement. Its high profile spurred legislative attention, contributing to the development of more robust policies for dealing with child abduction cases. Appeals and later legal proceedings. In subsequent years, some of the kidnappers sought to appeal their sentences, citing various legal and procedural arguments. However, the courts upheld the convictions, affirming the validity of the original trial and the strength of the evidence. The impact on law enforcement. The case also influenced law enforcement training, emphasizing the importance of rapid response, detailed evidence gathering, and victim support. Specialized task forces and victim advocacy groups emerged in later decades, partly inspired by cases like Chowchilla. Public reaction and media coverage. The trial and convictions were widely covered in newspapers, radio, and television. The media often portrayed the kidnappers as monsters, but also focused on the bravery of the children and the driver, celebrating their resilience. Families' perspectives. For the families of the victims, the trial was both a relief and a reopening of wounds. Seeing the kidnappers held accountable helped validate their pain and fear, but reliving the crime through testimony was emotionally taxing. Counselors and support groups worked to help families cope during this period. Lessons learned: prevention and awareness. The Chowchilla kidnapping underscored vulnerabilities in child safety, particularly regarding school transport. Schools and communities across the country began revising safety protocols, introducing background checks for drivers, emergency communication plans, and public awareness campaigns. Reflection on justice. While the legal system delivered punishment, the case also raised questions about the nature of justice. For survivors and families, no sentence could erase the trauma, but accountability was an important step in healing. In the final part, we'll reflect on the enduring legacy of the Chowchilla kidnapping, the lessons it taught, how the survivors shaped our understanding of trauma, and what this story means today. The story of the Chowchilla kidnapping is not just a tale of terror and survival. It's a powerful chapter in the ongoing dialogue about child safety, trauma, resilience, and justice. Decades after that July day in 1976, its echoes can still be felt, offering valuable lessons and inspiring hope. In this concluding part, we explore how the event shaped laws, psychology, community responses, and the personal lives of those involved, a catalyst for change in child safety protocols. One of the most immediate legacies of the Chowchilla kidnapping was a nationwide re-evaluation of school safety measures. School districts began implementing stricter screening processes for bus drivers and staff. Emergency preparedness drills became more common, educating children and adults alike on how to respond during crises. Communication channels between schools, parents and law enforcement improved, aiming to provide rapid alerts if emergencies arose, advancing trauma awareness and mental health support. The kidnapping underscored the profound psychological impact such experiences can have, especially on children. Since the 1970s, trauma psychology has evolved substantially. The Chowchilla survivors' long-term struggles and triumphs contributed to a growing awareness that healing requires ongoing comprehensive support. Today, trauma-informed care is a cornerstone in schools, hospitals, and social services, ensuring that victims receive tailored help that addresses emotional and physical wounds. Survivors as voices of resilience and advocacy. Many of the Chowchilla survivors have chosen to share their experiences publicly, raising awareness about child safety and trauma recovery. Their stories have been featured in books, documentaries, and interviews, helping to humanize the abstract concepts of fear and recovery. By speaking out, they've helped reduce stigma around trauma and inspired others facing similar challenges to seek help and hope. Community strength and the power of unity. The response of the Chowchilla community remains a model of solidarity in crisis. Neighbors, first responders and families came together immediately, providing resources, emotional support and determination. This collective spirit not only aided recovery, but also set an example for other communities facing emergencies. The impact on law enforcement practices. The case encouraged law enforcement agencies to develop more specialized units focused on child abduction and hostage situations. Inter-agency cooperation and rapid response protocols were enhanced, reducing response times and improving chances for successful rescues. These improvements have saved countless lives in the decades since. Reflection on the nature of courage. The bravery displayed by the bus driver and children in the face of unimaginable danger continues to inspire. Their collective courage, whether in planning the escape, supporting each other underground, or facing the aftermath, reminds us that resilience can thrive even in the darkest places. Remembering the victims and honoring their journey anniversary events and memorials keep the story alive, honoring the children's journey from victims to survivors. These commemorations serve as a reminder of the importance of vigilance, compassion, and the continuous work needed to protect children. How the Chowchilla case shapes our world today. In an era of ever-evolving threats, from online dangers to kidnapping, the lessons from Chowchilla remain deeply relevant. They emphasize the need for preparedness, the value of community, and the importance of understanding trauma's lasting effects. Final thoughts. Beyond survival, towards hope. While the kidnapping was a moment of darkness, it sparked growth in knowledge, community strength, and individual resilience. The story of Chowchilla is ultimately one of hope, that even in the worst circumstances, people can survive, heal, and transform pain into purpose. Thank you for exploring this profound story. If you'd like, we can dive deeper into related cases, trauma psychology, or other historic kidnappings. Just let me know in the comments what you want next.